There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello, BookTube. I'm Shawn the Book Maniac. Welcome back to my channel, and welcome back to another episode of Zooming In, which is a new series where I chat with bookish social media luminaries the world over about bookish articles. Today, I'd like to welcome back, it's the first time on this series, but his 700th time on my channel, Dan, formerly of the Weird Book Club channel on YouTube, and my dear friend. Welcome back, Dan.
Thank you for having me, Shawn. Yes, you've had me many times, and I hope this won't be the last.
Well, if you put it that way, we'll just skip over talking about the article. We're here to talk about a long form interview from the Paris Review. It's probably the first Paris Review interview I have read from start to finish. And this is not that easily available. I could borrow the e-copy of the issue from my library through Libby. So that's how I got a hold of it. But otherwise, I think you basically have to have a subscription. But in their issue number 258, maybe it's the second last issue, or maybe it's still the current issue, they had an art of fiction conversation that was about 30 pages long, I think, with the noted Nobel Prize winning Polish writer Olga Tokarczuk. And Dan and I have both read it, and we're here to chat about it. So, Dan, tell us about your relationship with Olga Tokarczuk.
We've had a tempestuous affair, Shawn, I have to say. Last year, I decided to read her sort of magnum opus, as it's described in the English-speaking literary press. To my knowledge, I think Flights was the one that I had heard about, first heard of her, and she was starting to get some buzz, in the literary sphere. And then Books of Jacob came out, and this was supposed to be kind of her masterpiece. And then I don't know if she won the Nobel Prize that same year or if this came out right afterwards.
Afterwards in English, but probably before in Polish. Absolutely.
Right. So yeah, I was intrigued, and also I'm kind of a sucker for really long and challenging books. So I dove into this one, and I have to say it was one of those books that I respected more than enjoyed. There was not for most of the book, there was not this sort of like visceral engagement quality. There were a lot of kind of political machinations and this era in Polish history that was being described, and the way that Jewish communities were integrated or not into sort of, mainstream or upper level society, nobility, given access to certain privileges and statuses, was interesting. And this whole kind of blurring the lines between religious and political evangelization. There were, I don't want to spoil. I don't know if we can really spoil like a 1,000-page novel, because there's just too much information to really share. But in any case, and I had the sense at the time that it was, historically based, but I wasn't quite sure to what extent it was representative of past history of Poland, and which characters were supposed to represent actually people that had lived at the time, and which were sort of the inventions of Tokarczuk. And that was actually something that I got out of this article, that I was, kind of scratched an itch that I had in that particular category. She went more into sort of her research process and why she likes to ground the fiction that she writes in some like pretty detailed level of historical reality. So I wasn't crazy about that one, but I thought, why not try maybe a shorter one? And there was another book that had been recommended to me called Drive Your Plow Over the Bones of the Dead, which is a pretty awesome title in my book. And the premise sounded really cool. Woman living out in the wilderness. There's some kind of murder mystery component. There's meditations on environmentalism, humanity's relationship with the natural world, and particularly animals. And there's also discussions of the poetry of William Blake, which I enjoy myself, and the sort of idea of these kind of a cross between an artist and sort of an almost like a mystical visionary that could describe William Blake. And there's also sort of these visionary episodes that the main character has in the novel. So all of those sound like the perfect ingredients for a book I would totally love, but I actually just like by the end of it, I could not wait for it to be over. I just felt that there was sort of this plot twisty element, and I just did not feel that it was executed in a way that made sense with a lot of the rest of the novel. And it was funny because that was another thing that she addressed in the interview, how she had not pre-scripted the ending. She sort of discovered it as she was writing it. And I was like, oh, well, I respect the process, but the result was not really my cup of tea. So anyway, I find her interesting, but she's definitely someone that I have a respect for, but not like a deep personal enjoyment of in my experience.
You have confirmed a lot of the biases that I had about her before reading this interview. I never wanted to read any of her books. The first book of hers that I ever heard of was Flight, and everybody said, people would say, "What's it about?" Oh, it's a novel about travel. That just sounds like the most horribly boring book. Like there's no continuity of characters. It's just a bunch of, I don't know what, scenes of people traveling or anecdotes about traveling or sociological musings or something. What the hell? That sounds terrible. So I was started off on the wrong foot with her because of what I heard about the one that everybody was talking about first, Flights. And then the Books of Jacob actually does sound interesting to me, but it's too long. I don't deal well with tomes. And Drag Your Plow Over the Bones of the Dead. I don't like murder mysteries at all. So if people have shouted at me when I've dismissed it that way. I know, Roz, you'll be listening. Roz said, it's not just a murder mystery. You should just read it. It's really, really good. You'll love it. The other things I've heard about it are that it's really kind of intellectual and stuff, and you're kind of confirming that. So, but yet everybody always talks about her, and I have a little bit of FOMO about it. So that's why I suggested that you and I read this interview. And the question for me, the animating question for me for the rest of this conversation is, has this interview made me want to read her more than I did before, which was virtually not at all? And has it made you reconsider trying another book? So maybe I'll go first, very briefly, and just say, no, it hasn't. I enjoyed the article. I thought it was fascinating. She sounds like a fascinating woman. Her books sound awful. I don't want to read them, with few exceptions. There was one that was like a memoir about the house that she lives in. And she talks about it a little bit more at the very end, and that concluding anecdote about kind of ghost or whatever, the woman, the grandmother that had lived there before, and she had named a character after that person that she could feel palpably in the house, only to discover long after the book was published that was actually the name of the woman, and she saw the woman's photograph, and that's how she'd imagined. Kind of intrigued me. But I just think she sounds really fascinating, and I would, rather than read any of her books, I don't want to read any of her books. They sound terrible. I would like to read more interviews with her. I'd like to drink with her.
Yeah, I mean, I think the fact that she won the Nobel puts her more in that category of, that was an interesting thing that she talked about in the interview too, this sort of dual pull towards being this sort of independent, almost reclusive person who pursues their own interests, largely writing.
Yeah.
And then also having the sense of social responsibility, the fact that you owe something to your fellow human beings and to the natural world maybe as well, and trying to reach out and use your position to help other people if you have skills they don't have or resources that they don't have. I didn't know before reading this interview that she had a background in psychoanalysis and that she had been trained in the specifics of it are going to be lost on me, but it sounds like she worked with a lot of folks that were maybe in addiction recovery at least at one point.
At one point.
And she talked about how much Jung and Freud had an influence on her understanding of, how the human mind constructs reality and makes sense of the world. And that in the discussion sounded very interesting, but I was a little bit surprised to hear that she had this big fascination with psychoanalysis, because I always, at least the two books that I've read, I don't know that I would describe them as like intense psychological portraits. Maybe I don't know enough about those theoretical canons to really say this in a informed way, but I think of her, based on what I've read, as someone who's really interested in like certain time periods in history, specific places, specific conditions in which people were living their lives, and very rooted almost in the more of like the material world, I guess. Definitely there's a lot of this mystical stuff interwoven throughout. And now I'm gonna kind of take a little side path here, but to your question about whether or not the interview could convince you to read another book, the descriptions of her other stuff did sound kind of interesting. I guess it's more common for her books to have some specific event in history or group of people that she's interested in talking about. She starts from there and then sort of discovers a character by doing research and starts to hear them speak, and that's where her writing begins from. And it almost made it even more surprising to me, or strange, that Flights was her big introduction, or one of the big introductions to the English speaking literary world, because it sounds like her most abstract and her least grounded in any particular event. I haven't read it myself, so that might not be true, but like you were saying, it just sounds so up in the air, like
sounds so flighty. Sounds so flighty, Dad.
Yeah, that's right. So, and it was funny too, because she even mentioned that she turned it into her Polish editor, and the editor thought she had turned in like an incomplete manuscript. It was so kind of fragmentary, the structure of it, and the way it sort of went about to all of its different subject matter, I guess.
That's worth quoting in full. She writes, "When I sent the completed manuscript to the publisher, and I can't pronounce the name of the publisher, they emailed me back to say I must have attached the wrong file. We'd signed a contract for a novel. What was this unfinished piecemeal thing?"
I mean, I guess if you're surprising your I assumed that they had worked together in the past too. So it's like, if you're pulling something out of your hat that's so new and different that even people who are familiar with your work are confused, then that's something. Another thing that was sort of useful was it did go through kind of a list of her novels and just gave brief summaries of their premises. I don't think all of them have been translated into English, and some of the ones discussed are still in progress. So obviously that's not coming down the pike for a while yet. But yeah, I guess I would be interested in reading something that, again, was more of like the historical fiction, but it would definitely be further down the road. This past year, I read a lot of different Polish authors. That was another reason why I revisited her work. I definitely have discovered a bunch of her country people whose work I'm more deeply enthusiastic about. So anyway,
I was turned off by all the psychoanalytic stuff, because I just think, oh, that's all nonsense, just like religion. It's complete nonsense. And if I can see it in my fiction, the fiction goes into the trash, because it's I mean, psychology, fine, but Freudian psychoanalytic theory, and Jung was just this stupid old sexist poop with all these, Chronicles of Narnia bullshit. So yeah, that's the beginning and end of my thoughts on Jung. So as much as this interview made me interested in her, it was hard not to stop reading. It was hard not to bail on this interview when I heard how deeply invested she is in astrology. Oh,
Oh.
how can I respect somebody who, I mean, I don't, just in your own personal life, if you would like to read your horoscopes for the day, but like, I'm just like, does she ground her fiction in astrology? It sounds like she does.
Shawn,
Oh,
don't let the younger generation of homosexuals hear you badmouth astrology. We're gonna have a rainbow uprising against your channel.
come
Yeah, actually,
on.
you definitely would not want to read "Drive Your Plow Over the Bones of the Dead" then, because that is very deeply a part of like the main character's worldview, and she approaches it in this, very systematic, scientific way. But still, I mean, it requires an underlying faith
Suspension of
in,
disbelief.
yeah, in the ways in which these movements of celestial bodies impact, events in real
Oh,
life.
well, then that does it. I will never try to read that book because
Yeah.
that just disgusts me. How could I take anything seriously that is grounded in a sober, serious investment in astrology? I mean, it's like reading a Christian novel. Jesus Christ, are you kidding me? But the rest of her personality and her life experiences, her description of the writing process, all of that I thought was really fascinating.
Yeah, I wanted
So
to ask you too. I mean, you said that you hadn't really read stuff from this series of Paris Review.
The Paris Review.
Yeah, is it called like The Art of Fiction, or these author interviews have their own like series title? I can't
I
recall.
believe that's right. The Art of Fiction.
I was curious, since you chose this article, do you often read sort of this like craft talk type discussion or biographical stuff on authors that you enjoy? Is this because, some people, and I would count myself among them, for large part, don't need to. I'm pretty satisfied with just letting kind of the book speak for itself. And there are some exceptions when you get deeply invested in an author's back catalog. You're like, almost start to feel like you're stalking them slightly, and you're like, all right, Wikipedia, okay, oh, they wrote an autobiography, all right, and we'll look into that and see if we can kind of divine how they wrote that really weird ass thing in that novel. Yeah, but by and large, I don't necessarily look into pieces that are about, authors describing their own work or their artistic process. Is that something that generally interests you?
I would say not generally, but specifically, the more that I love a book or love a second book by the author, the more curious I get about their
Mm.
life. But beyond that, I don't need to know anything about the author before I start the book, and typically don't really want to know very much about their life until maybe after I finished it. And then if I liked it, yeah, I might be curious to at least scan the Wikipedia page.
Mhm.
But if I didn't enjoy it, I have no interest in their life, so I don't check anything out about them. But
Erase them from history.
for my favorite writers, I do get biographically curious about them and want to read a biography or whatever. It's an excellent question. So, like, would I read a Paris review interview with an author just to see if I might be interested in reading them? Aside from this experiment, I've never done that in my life, and I wouldn't just limit it to the Paris review, but any author interview, no. But in the process of slumming around looking for articles for this series, that's what happened. I found it, and maybe Dan went to Poland a few months ago, and he's interested in Polish lit. Maybe he and I could read this, and that's why we're here. But I don't make a habit of it.
We got to keep that content mill churning, Shawn. You're getting deep in the trenches. The Paris Review. I pulled a few quotes out, and one of them relates to psychoanalysis that we were talking about before. And I think what was interesting to me about it was she kind of articulated a way that I try to evaluate like an author's, like, what is a successful book, right? Or like a good book. it has to, because each book is unique, it has to kind of set its own terms, right? And you can only judge a book's success based on what it's trying to do. You can't say it's a bad biography if it's a work of fiction, right? And she described it, she made this analogy to the psychoanalytic process that I thought really resonated with how I try to, judge a book on its own terms, if that's a thing that you can
Oh, I think
discover.
we
And
marked. I think
yeah,
we marked one of the same passages. Please continue.
yeah. So she said, sometimes I think the way a writer opens a novel is akin to how clinical psychology begins with a kind of contract with the reader. You establish a mutual trust on which the subsequent process depends, so that the necessary stages of resistance, transference, and so on can take place. All this must lead to a certain release, a kind of catharsis, such that the patient who's undergone psychotherapy is no longer the person he was at the beginning. That's what a writer does as well, and how fiction works on its readers. Setting up a legible agreement and upholding it encourages the audience to keep reading despite all the ways the book might disturb them, so that at the end they will come out changed. I believe that every good novel changes its reader in some fashion. And that is really why I ended up sticking with that super long novel, because I was like, I don't know where she's going with this or what exactly she's doing, but she seems very consistent, and there's enough to keep me invested and think, okay, well, she's brought me this far, maybe let's see what happens if we go further. And that was, I think that really articulated what I respected about that book and why I continued to engage with it, because not through any like explicit statement of purpose, but just through writerly craft or repeated themes or, stuff you can pick up on over time, you get a sense of, okay, maybe this is a bit of a slog. Maybe this is kind of grim and depressing, and maybe all of these people keep changing their plans constantly and having strange religious ecstatic orgies with one another, but it's all of a piece somehow. And I think that sort of baseline consistency is definitely how I try to evaluate whether I'm going to give up on something entirely or if I'm going to stick with it, because I feel like the author has at least committed to trying to see their concept through.
I marked the same passage and I loved the description, except that she makes an analogy with psychoanalysis or clinical psychology. Because that part I don't care about. But the way she described that contract with the reader and everything, I thought it was just brilliant. She's brilliant. I could listen to her talk all day. And she, even about small things, like she says, to get going, I need a strong cup of tea and a game of solitaire. It's like running a comb through my brain.
Oh yeah.
That was probably my favorite quote in the whole piece. So, I mean, she's very interesting. I don't want to read her books.
Yeah, it is kind of interesting too. And she also brought up this distinction. She talked about her first novel, or maybe just some kind of referring back to her early work in general, that it was the work more of a reader than a writer.
Yeah, I marked
And
that too.
often this conflation of those skill sets seem like they go so much hand in hand, and yet the processes are almost like a mirror image of each other, right? And the actual grind of trying to produce a work and decide what it's going to be is not the same thing as maybe the grind of trying to like digest a work and get something useful or interesting out of it. You'd think those would be more complementary skill sets than often they seem to be in reality. And even just sort of general as like a cultural figure or a thinker, like you're saying, you find her very charismatic and her points well crafted, but the way they're presented in her fiction probably would not appeal to you at all.
Yeah, and that's fine. It takes all kinds to make a world, and she's a greatly well-loved, greatly respected author, and I'm so glad that she was one of the, what is it, 7 or 8 women that have won the Nobel Prize in Literature. Richly deserved, I'm sure. And she's not a writer for me, I think. But
Well, I was also delighted to hear that she was pissing off right-wing nationalists.
Absolutely.
I was surprised that she said that she really felt she's not that well understood or appreciated in Poland among Polish speaking and reading critics, at least among the critical establishment. Although I seem to recall when I was in Warsaw that I saw an advertisement of some kind that was like supposed to be a big adaptation of some of her name was on prominent advertisements around the city. So maybe she, is making stuff happen a little bit more in the big city. When I went to Warsaw, I tried to make a point of visiting museums that somehow tied into some of the books that I had read. And one of them is the acronym is Polin, Polin, but it has a longer name, and it's something like the history of Jewish peoples in Poland or something like this. Very beautiful building, very interestingly constructed, how you sort of get guided through all of these different eras. And it starts back in sort of the medieval times and it goes all the way up through the present day. So it's quite a sweeping historical scope that they set up for themselves. And the Books of Jacob, the biggest novel that I'd read by Tokarczuk, is set in the 18th century, I believe, around the era of the Enlightenment. And it talks about, the existence of Jewish communities in Poland at that time. And so when I was at that museum, the Poland Museum, and it talked about how the sort of like socio-historical conditions that led to Poland being the home to the largest Jewish population in all of Europe up to the point of World War II. I never realized that. It was spoken of in her fiction as this sort of unique set of conditions, and how much that resonated with the historical reality that was being portrayed in the museum. I felt like I was better prepared to understand the history by virtue of having read her fiction. So I did appreciate that about her work.
Yeah. And who knows, maybe I will try that when I get over my allergy to tackling big tomes. I need you to hold my hand and get me through that one, Dan. It's a neurosis I'm still battling. But
I've got bad news, Shawn. There's stars in that one too. They're exerting their celestial bodies are exerting their influence all over her fiction. I'm not sure if you can
maybe in
escape.
historical fiction it wouldn't bother me. But to hear that a contemporary author believes in it, anyway, I think we've done it up good, Dan. So thank you so much for your insight, and let's do this again. Do something like this again, shall we?
I would love it, Shawn. Thanks for having me.